There we go.
Okay, now that we're recording, thank you everyone for hopping on and talking about HDAP in the new Salesforce system. We got a lot of fun stuff planned, and hopefully it should be easier for everyone walking through it. This is the first time this program is going into Salesforce, so there may be some hiccups along the way. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions, so feel free to let us know. Let Ashley know as the manager of the section, or me, who will be covering for Ashley, starting in about roughly a month or so. Um, and then our program staff, Neely and Ian, who are here. If you have any questions, just feel free to let us know. The first thing, though, I did want to talk about before we walk through the application itself for HDAP is just some of the differences and some of the terminology and stuff, because I think it can be very confusing, especially when in Ocean, which is our current system, the screen looks pretty similar from the grantee and on development side of things, but in Salesforce, in this new system we are using, the visual differences are pretty significant, which is just to make the grantees experience a lot smoother. And the OFA staff who have been in there will probably know exactly what I'm talking about here when I go through the differences. So, like I said, the key distinction is that there's two separate but connected systems, which I think can be very confusing because when we're talking about Salesforce, we're really talking about the system that Department of Development is using to manage our grants, which is what this refers to as Salesforce Core, which is kind of the back end of things where we can see everything, where we're setting up the programs, we can see your applications, we can see draw requests, all of the above. However, on the grantee side of things, we have what we call the portal, listed here as the Salesforce portal, which is a very concise and specific user interface that you're looking at, that is specific to the programs that you're eligible for. So in this case, it's pretty much just the HDAP applications you'll be putting in, and it will be very specific to any of the applications that you have submitted for that program. And I also wanted to briefly talk about some of the key differences. Most of the terminology is similar, if not the same, between Ocean, our existing program, and the new programs we're putting into Salesforce now. In Ocean, I think it was just generally called a program. In Salesforce, it's called a funding program. I think there are some different names with like applied program, a program application. And then the biggest difference, which we'll get into in a moment, when I actually show you the application, is that Ocean has drop-down menus, tabs all across the top. And whilst the Salesforce portal that you'll be applying through also has menus at the top that you can select, it's not quite in the same format. It's mainly in that tab format, and you click and you can access things from there as opposed to going through a long drop-down list, where you have to go from here to here to here and hope that you don't drag the cursor off the screen, and then you lose where you're at. Most importantly, I think that is different from Ocean is the OHID login. I know all the OFA staff, or at least I'm sure, have an OHID login, so this should be pretty straightforward for you. But we link the OHID that you have, your professional account that's linked to you as a staff member of OFA individually. That is linked to an organization and an individual account within Salesforce. However, there's no individual login that you have to do. It's all through OHID, through the app system that they have there, which we can get into pretty soon as well. And unlike Ocean, where the applications, the draws, status reports, all of the above. I'm pretty sure you had to go through separate tabs with all three of those to be able to navigate to them, which is can be really confusing and it can be hard to understand the connections between everything. But as you will be able to see, hopefully, they're all in the same place. They're all directly connected to your application submission, so that should be a lot easier for you to be able to navigate that and see where things are at within the system. Um, Also in Ocean, this is kind of a small change that I wanted to address here and that we're addressing to all of our grantees as they go into Salesforce, is that the draw requests specifically went directly to our financial team that work with our program staff. However, going forward, and even in some of our existing programs that are in Ocean or your existing grants that are in Ocean, our grant analysts, our program staff are going to be looking at some draw requests, which wasn't the case before, but we will be keeping that consistent going forward, regardless. Now, that is just a lot of information. This is very high level, but we will get into the actual application in the moment. Barbara, since you're the one representative from OFA who's here at the moment, if you have any specific questions when I'm walking through the application, please just chime in and ask away,
Will do.
because this would be a good time to do that. So thank you. If you have anything that we want to
So
talk about.
far, I'm with you so far.
Good. Okay. I don't think we really need to talk through this. You'll know what this is, Barbara. This is our TA site. There is a specific page in there where you can contact us if you have any problems with the system, which is different from the programmatic side of things, which will create, without going into specifics, it will create a case that we can track on our back end. So especially if you want to make sure that there's a paper trail for if you have any technical problems, you'll be able to do this, and I can put that in the chat later on. But there
Yeah,
is a little form on the TA page that you can use.
So
Yep.
is the TA page new?
No, this is the same site that some of our other programs use for the documentation and stuff like that, where it's
Okay.
linked. It's not very different or any more exciting, but there is
a new tile on the TA site for the
Okay.
Ocean to Salesforce transition. That's where this lives. So it's the same TA site, just a different tile.
Gotcha. Okay, I see it now. Kind of looks like an ocean. Sorry.
yes. Mhm.
Okay, I hadn't been to the TA website for a while, so.
No, that's
All right.
okay. And I don't think you have any required documents, so in terms of HTAP stuff, you really want to have a reason to get in there. But I did want to mention that we can, since you know where that is, you have the link, but it is helpful because things can get lost over email, I know.
Yes.
And I don't think we'll dive into this, but that's just general technical assistance. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing and reshare my screen to go into the actual application. And let me make sure it doesn't make me log into OHID again. Okay. I will share the OHID side of things before I actually get into Salesforce, because it literally just updated today. So things are going to look a little different than anything else we have talked about previously. I did want to mention on recording here that the way you're going to access this system, instead of a direct link, you'll be able to go to your apps within your OHID login,
Okay.
and there'll be, we call them tiles. They're, with the new update, they don't really look like tiles, but you will have a community organization portal that you select to open it up. And that's for all of you, you know, Barbara, you as the main person who's doing the application, and for all your other staff who will be managing draw requests and all of that stuff. But this name is going to, I'm assuming, is going to say consistent community organization portal, which will, if we select it, should take us to the home screen. Great. Give me just a second. Now you know my OHID in case you're curious. And I do know currently there's a very short like timeout window. It's someone else, Jake, I know you're on here, can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really short. It's like 15 minutes or something like that. So
like 15 seconds.
that's what it feels like.
Very short window.
Yeah. So there's a good chance that if you're going back and forth or you get interrupted with something that it's going to log you out. But you should be able to easily log back in with the same login credentials. So that shouldn't be a problem at all. But I did want to show from that app that it takes you to the new homepage. The information here may not be super relevant to you, but there are some direct links to look at like the applications that you've created or submitted. And I think there's some other general FAQs with some information on here, but this is the main landing page that you should be seeing once you log into the community organization portal, which is what we're just calling like the general new Salesforce system. And as you can see, comparatively to Ocean, it's maybe having more information, but it's a little more straightforward and cleaner. I know this like picture here along the top will change, but in general, this is what the homepage should look like. There's a couple tabs up here at the top that will be important to you. Program applications, which is what we're going to do to actually create the application. There's my applications, which is if you've already started an application or you've submitted one or you're going to draw requests, all of that. This is where you're going to look at for that. And then there's also a support tab, which we can get into later if we have time, but very similar to the TA site issue, there's a direct option here to be able to submit technical issues within the system that you're having, as opposed to anything that's programmatic, which you'd probably just reach out to us and ask any questions on. But since we're creating the application from scratch, we'd be going here to this Program Applications tab. Actually, let me switch over. Okay. This should fix itself. Okay, no, I don't know what's going on here. Give me just a second. I will also mention that there are problems with, here, I can stop sharing my screen for a second so you don't see all the confusing stuff on the back end. If you have multiple tabs open, especially if they're in different systems, it can get very confused. And the system doesn't like that, but I'm going to log in and to development side of things so I can get back to the home screen.
Miss Rachel, we're just getting started, so we're going to review
okay.
application stuff today, not draw. So this won't be as relevant, maybe, unless we find out that there's a mix.
Doesn't hurt to know that side of it as well.
Yes.
You know, for when people are on leave and that sort of thing.
And we're recording too. That way we can have it saved for reference and to share with Ben when he gets back.
All right, I've got it fixed now.
Okay.
It wasn't showing up correctly because of how that page was linked with my account. However, like I said, program applications is where you go to initiate the application once you've logged in. You'll notice here that there's a bunch of different stuff because I have multiple eligible programs that this test account can apply for. However, I'm just going to select HDAP. If for whatever reason you have multiple programs, you'd see it here, but all of HDAP, regardless of the funding source, is going to be listed as one program here on this screen. So I'm going to click the tile, and there's going to be some general information here that we don't have listed out since this is just a test example, but there may be an extended description. There's going to be dates for the application when it opens and when it closes, which is particularly relevant to you. And I don't know if it says it doesn't say application start or application end. So just make sure you keep that in mind when you're looking at it here. But there's this nice button here at the bottom that says apply for program, and it's going to bring up this pop-up menu, which is where you can select the funding source. Since HDAP
Okay.
is broken down by the 3 funding sources, home, NHTF, OHTF, just like before in Ocean, you'll have to individually select each funding source and do the application for that specific funding source.
Okay.
That shouldn't be anything new. I know we talked to our IT people about having this all be in one, but it doesn't really work out for reporting purposes since we have to distinguish between, in particular, home funds. But for example purposes, since home has some extra steps in it in the application compared to the other ones, we're going to do the home application as the example. But you will have to do them individually, is the important takeaway here. So I'm going to create the application. It's gonna take a minute. The most important thing here on this first page to keep in mind is, I'm starting to highlight it here, there's this banner across the top that has all the relevant information for this specific application that you'll want to keep in mind. Most important is that there's a specific application number. So if you're having any concerns that are specific to either your home request, NHTF request, whichever, you'll have 3 separate application numbers that you'll want to keep track of. And that'll be really helpful if you have any questions, and it'll be helpful for us to track that on the back end. If we can just search by the application number and then we can find it immediately. And then there's some numbers for the grant request that will update as we go along. And this is also where it says what the funding type is. So if you can't distinguish between them when you're trying to select which application you're looking at, you'll be able to tell when you're actually in it at the top banner, no matter where we're at in the application. All right. And then there's just all these grayed out boxes. There's nothing you can do here. This is information that's already inputted in the system with your contact and with your agency in general. So Barbara, I know you had some questions, or at least a request earlier to add people in. That's something that we have to do on the back end. You can't necessarily initiate that from a grantee's perspective yourself.
Okay.
So the program type's already grayed out because we selected that when we created the application. This is where you would put your program name. I'm not sure how you distinguish them, or if you just say something like HStep home projects or something generic, since I know there's different programs that OFA has that you put some of the different funding sources into. So however you want to distinguish that on the program name here, it's just a type in. There's nothing you have to select. You can do that however you were doing before. But what I would think is the most important portion, well, of most of the application, but of especially this section, is the program narrative piece here. Because someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the narrative is what generates the scope of work within the grant agreement. Is that true?
So that's correct. So that's what will copy over to the doc gen when we create the grant agreements.
Yes. So this is the most important. There's a whole long description here that it recommends some of the information you can include. I mean, obviously, some of the big stuff is which OFA program you're intending to put the funds into, like 4%, 9% Ohio LITech, whatever that may be. You can list that here. Just make sure you be specific and clear within the program narrative. We can dig into that later if you're interested in the types of information. But just make sure you're taking some time to write out as much information as you can with how OFA is going to be using these funds. I mean, they can be similar across the board with just numbers switched out between the three funding sources, so that's not really a problem. But make sure you keep that in mind. Oh, important here that I kind of glossed over before. You can walk through any piece of the application. You won't get stuck at any point. If you need to change anything while you're already in it, you can hit previous or hit next and cycle through each page. But if there is something that's specifically marked as required, you'll likely not be able to move on. So if you're having any errors, that's probably the problem.
Does it pop
Here-
up with errors?
Yep.
And like tell you at the top error request?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can probably, I don't know if I have a chance to do that now. I guess I can just show you
Okay.
what it looks like. Oh, okay. It won't even let you go. But if there's any other problems with the system that aren't like validation for fields you need to input, there'll just be a big banner that'll pop up here that says, oh, you had this error. And it may or may not be very descriptive, but that just means there was something wrong with how things were set up when you were creating the application. Similar to if you have anything where you need to save as opposed to just like field entry here, there'll be a green box that'll pop up that says like this has been saved. Here in the like general program or HDAP specific details page is where you'll put in your total requests, which I'm just going to put 2 million for example's sake. Obviously, it's probably higher than that and varies depending on the funding source, but this is just for an example. And you'll see these grayed out boxes here with the project funds available to allocate. It may be concerning because it says 0, but the only reason it says 0 is because this pulls from the project and activity breakdown that you do later on in the application. So that may be a little confusing, but this is so it's all in one place when you're reviewing the application as a whole. It pulls in that information and you're not able to change it from here at this point. So that's going to be 0 and that's okay. But we will put in the general overall request of the funds. This is also where you would put any estimated leveraged funds, which I know you tend to have a lot of them. This is not anything that's going to pull up into here in the banner, but this is just kind of a good review for us to see how, in terms of total leveraged funds that you have available. So in this case, I'm just going to put 10 million or something like that. And you'll notice, since we're going to get to leveraged funds, that this is just grayed out here. This is also where you would put in your projected, like, general number of like rental projects or units that you're going to be funding. Ashley, did you have anything else to say on this? I know the outcomes are kind of
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say
unique.
there's nothing really new here. Again, this is the stuff that we'll also be pulling into that scope of work, that attachment A piece of the grant agreement, but we understand that it's just projections at this point.
And, I don't know if we'll be able to get to site addresses today. There will be the opportunity to have like to report the specific outcomes with the site addresses. This is just kind of the general projected that we have to have on the application. So here's the first page that we have to actually start adding specific pieces of information. So this is where we add any leveraged funds. I'm not sure how specific you have been in applications in the past, but just for example purposes, so you know how this is done, is, I'll go back one. There's a button right here, new, which is where it'll do a pop-up, which is pretty much how everything is done, including the project and the activity information that you're going to be inputting. And then you are required to put like the leverage fund provider. So I'm just going to write out LIHTC, something generic for this example, but you'll know more specifics on your end. And since I know the tax credit is specific to OFA in terms of our programs, I'm going to put that in as an example. So here you have like a category, general categories of where the funds are coming from, because there are like other federal, there's like CDBG, there's a bunch of other options. However, in this case, I'm going to do the LIHTC category, and then there's a specific one. Oh, here it is. That just says tax credit that you can use if you're using those as leveraged funds, which I'm pretty sure in most cases you are. So I'm just going to add a dollar amount to that. Yeah, Barbara?
You're saying, yep, we use the LIHTC for leverage funds.
Yeah. And that's what I thought. And you can, separate it out however you like. You can be as specific as you like here. We aren't going to individually link this to anything in the actual project and activity breakdown. But I do know it's important information for us to know what leverage funds you have.
I will say that there's more detail on the housing site address setup, breaking down specifically what leverage is being used specifically on what sites. So you can add in things like your FHLB or local home or whatever other kinds of sources you're using. This is just anything that you do know at the time of application.
Okay, will we have to come back here to update this for it to update for the address? Or would they not be connected?
I don't think so. I don't think they're connected.
I don't think
Great
so either.
news. Good news.
Yeah, because this is just like general knowledge. So
Okay.
I don't think we'll have a problem, which is nice. I'm not going to go through and add anything else, but I will mention that. Will it let me do this here? I think I can just input something here. That depending on the fund type, it may pop up other information. The easiest example here is loan, term of the loan, interest rate, stuff like that. I don't know if that's going to be relevant, but you may, depending on what you select, there may be additional fields that it is asking you for. So just make sure you're filling those out, even if something is like 0 because it's not relevant. So now that we're done with the leveraged funds, we're going to move on to what I think is like the real meat of the application is where we put in the projects, where we put in the activities. So it'd probably be best just to walk through that instead of explaining it from a broad point of view. Regardless, if you're requesting funds, you need to have the project, you need to have the activity. So I'm going to say new project, which is kind of the higher level. You will have 3 separate options, which I don't think should be anything different than what is done previously. Home specifically has the operating expenses, which is where the CHOTO set aside requirements are located at. For the other 2 funding sources, OHTF and HTF, they'll just be an administration option and a rental housing development option. For this first example, because it's simpler, I think I'm just going to put administration. I'm going to manually type in this required project name. I guess I could put like OPA admin or something a little more specific. But you can list out whatever you like here. And then the actual budget amount with, shocker, is required. I'm just going to put a low amount here within the total for this. But once I've completed that information, I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And as you can see, there is that green little pop-up box up here that'll show you it was saved successfully. Hopefully it'll always save successfully, but if there's any problems, it will tell you there and you'll be able to go back through and do it. You'll notice here, once you've added the project, that now it gives you the opportunity to add the activity, which is kind of the lower level. The very important thing about the activities is that the requested award amount is not calculated based off of all of your project totals. It is calculated based on your activity total. So if there's no activities listed here, this is just going to stay 0 once we move on and it has a chance to refresh. But that's very helpful to keep in mind, even though kind of the higher project level is a lot of the times what we're really talking about when it comes to the application. This is why we have to add the activities, even if they may not be relevant for site address setup and some of the other stuff at the moment. You'll only have one option for admin, so that's pretty easy and standard. I'm going to add the exact same amount since there's not more than one activity here. And then I'd encourage you to add any comments like what the admin budget would be used for. I don't think any of that information is pulled into the grant agreements. So I guess that's not super important, but it is just helpful for us to have a good knowledge of what this year's program requests are going to be used for. So feel free to put any description in there that you think would be relevant for us when we're reviewing your request. So I'm going to hit save successfully, and then you see it listed out here. This isn't super relevant, but I will mention because it is a feature built into the system, and in case things potentially change, there are outcomes here that are individualized by activity. You're not required to, I don't think we're requiring you to do that for this application purposes because the information, I believe, will be exactly the same as that initial page, but there is the ability to add outcomes.
That
Ashley,
would
I'll
also
let you.
that would also be another part that you would be able to put more specifics on the housing site address piece. So once you have a better sense of, acquiring land or acquiring structures or any of those specific outcomes or units rehabbed, units constructed, things like that would be specifically tied to the housing site address setup.
And then the other piece, Ashley, with the leveraged funds, are they required to specifically add the leverage to admin or any of the project funds?
No,
Okay.
I would think at this point that you're probably just putting all of the leverage funds that you associate with the project under the rental new development, so they could just all go under there for now.
And this won't require them to do so, so they can add that only if they need to. So the admin stuff's pretty straightforward. There's not much complexity with adding that in, but it does have to be accounted for as a separate project because of like system accounting purposes, and it has to be tracked separately.
And also just generating the budget for the grant agreement document itself.
Exactly. But I'm going to go into and create another project. We did allow you to do each of the categories more than once. I don't know if there's an instance in which you would want to be doing any of these more than once, as that may complicate things on the site address side of things. So
With
for-
Ocean, we did, like each project, like we may have 5 to 10 rental housing development projects per,
and that is tied to
application.
like the sites, like your actual projects that you're approving, correct? In Ocean, that's how it was?
yes.
Okay. So we won't have to do that here, which is why
Okay.
I wanted to bring that up, because I think that's important. We have the site address system, which is not what we're looking at on this page. This is
Okay.
just kind of like general, I would say, accounting purposes. And we're actually not getting very specific, and I can explain that in a moment. But what we consider projects in our system is different from your projects that you are funding. Which I know gets so confusing, and it got even more confusing because you actually inputted them as projects in Ocean. But for this is just like the money breakdown, not specific
Okay.
to any of the projects that you're funding. So
Okay.
fingers crossed, you shouldn't have to do an amendment every single time you want to add an address.
Nice.
That's the ideal setup that we want.
Yes.
So the bulk of the funds are going to be in the rental housing development. So that's what I'm going to show now. You can do the project name as generic as you want, and then you can add the budget, which I wrote down so that I didn't have to do math on the fly. So once I have that general project bucket set up, I'll hit save, just like with admin. And it may, if you notice that was a good example, this add activity button may not show up instantly, especially if your connection may be slower or whatever. So if you have any issues where buttons aren't popping up, it's usually a good idea to wait like 30 seconds or just completely reload the page. There can always be random issues that'll pop up where things aren't showing correctly, and 9 times out of 10, that's how they can be resolved. So here under the general like rental housing development project bucket, this is where things get very different from how it was set up in Ocean. We messed around with this a ton, but this is the ideal solution that will make things the easiest for OFA while also getting us the information we need. So we've effectively completely removed the activity breakdown.
Okay.
Before there was like 8 different activity options that were
Mhm.
all things that we considered eligible activities for OFA to use the funds on. And some of those were specific to funding source, but in general, most of them were the same. The problem with that was you had to do an amendment every time you wanted to like move funds over from categories. And this
Mhm.
system is not set up to easily allow the movement of funds in the way that you need it. Since I know you don't really know the specific eligible, what we call activities like expenses ahead of time, because you're still waiting on the applications from your developers or whoever's applying for your programs. So in this case, we're just going to have a general housing development activity bucket, and then we can confirm that funds are being used appropriately when you submit like the draw request for the site addresses.
Okay.
So for the activity budget, that's just going to be 1-for-1 since there's only one eligible activity. And this is where you can get into the description of what you're going to be doing with the general pot of funds.
Okay.
I would say for that narrative box, probably just reiterate again your estimated amount of like buildings with an estimated amount of units. Maybe just revisit that information in that narrative box.
And also, I think it's helpful to point out here that every level that you're working with here, project activity, if for some reason you have specific leverage and outcomes attached to it, you can edit pretty much anything, or you can delete it if it's messed up. It may not be super clear here because you have to go over to the caret for the activities, but that's where you go and do that. So there's that general larger bucket. Last thing we need to do, because this is home funds, specific to home, there is the Chodo reporting requirements for those funds. So it doesn't really, oh, I don't know what just happened there with my screen going black. It doesn't necessarily say Chodo here off the top, but the third category for home specifically is operating expenses. That's where the Chodo information is going to be tracked.
Just for clarity,
Yes.
we don't use the Chodo operating expenses. So we meet the Chodo set aside under the rental development. So Chodo operating expenses is one piece of overall Chodo compliance, but we meet that Chodo under the other activity. So that may be okay.
Right.
Like, okay, I just wanted to make
Sure.
that there was a way to track Chodo under the other one as well. It wasn't only being tracked here.
I believe we have it similar to how it was in Ocean. There's a checkbox because I think we
Okay.
ended up putting
Okay.
the home match and the Chodo checkboxes next to each other because they were kind of the unique. Is this Chodo? Is this home match boxes?
Yay. All right, good.
Now, Ashley, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that tracked in the site address setup, or because they are still putting it separately here, right? But we
Yeah, I
know
guess
that
that's a
it's included
question.
under the general project bucket still.
Yeah, I guess that's a question, Barbara, that maybe you can help me think through is so we mirrored this off of the way that Ocean ran, and Ocean had Chodo operating as its own thing. Was that for IDIS purposes to make sure that we were pulling from the correct Chodo bucket in IDIS?
Yes. So they're two different activities, and I believe
Yeah.
they're two eligible uses to meet Chodo set aside, and they are two different things in IDIS. So they should, I would think, be set up separately like they were in Ocean.
So from
Okay.
your all's perspective, like you would know what would go under this then from the application perspective?
Yes, because like Chodo operating expenses, you'd be working with a Chodo to help them build capacity. They wouldn't actually be doing any rental units that year. So it's separate than an address setup. So like under Chodo operating expenses, you wouldn't have an address set up because you're
Right.
just working with a specific Chodo that you're helping them build capacity.
So we're good to leave it
Okay.
as is. I will just need to remember that when we do this with ops so that they know where to pull from for draws and stuff.
Okay. That's helpful to know. But like you said, with the having to be accounted for separately, I think that's why it's set up like this. So,
And that was good. I just wanted to make sure there was still a way to capture that Chodo in the rental housing, and it sounds like there is. So perfect.
yes. Okay, so I just did the project setup. I'm going to add the activity. For some reason, only the activity has Chodo listed after it. I don't know why it doesn't do that at the project level, but whatever. We'll add the exact same amount. You can add the description as well. Okay. This should be your full breakdown of your project level and your activity level, which is we really care about like the higher level project categories. But like I said, you do have to have the activities here below. Ashley, real quick before we move on. Do the leveraged funds need to be specifically tied to these project types, or is it sufficient for this screen to just have them listed out and we know they have the leveraged funds available?
I believe, and I guess Barbara, correct me if I'm wrong, do you all use any sort of leverage for the Chodo operating, or does all of your leverage go into the rental development?
Of our leverage goes into rental development.
So then I would say whatever's on that original leverage fund screen, just go ahead and add it into that rental housing activity here under that.
So we'll do that here then. Actually, I need to double check what that number was. Okay, I should put 2 million. There's not going to be a validation issue here because it's not technically required with how the application was built, but just so we're all on the same page that we're expecting you to add that in here so we know. It will list out a bunch of your leveraged funds and it's individual because it allows you to piece things out. So you'll notice that here, when I added that leveraged fund specific to this activity and project, it only lists slide tech because that's the only thing I inputted. But it should have all of your options available. And did I get enough zeros? No. Okay. I'm going to put the full amount since we know it all goes here. And then it'll show up here and you'll be able to see that they're specifically connected. Okay. I do want to stop for a moment since this is kind of like the bulk of the funding breakdown in the application.
Just real quick, Josiah, go back to the banner and show how everything's kind of adding up at the top.
Oh, yeah. So when you're first on this page, none of this stuff is going to update until you've clicked next or previous. I think that's just because it needs time to catch up. And once you've moved on, that's when it knows to update this banner up top. You will notice because I had all of these activities listed out here, the grant award went up to the full grant award amount that we inputted in the beginning, because it calculates it based off of this budgeted activities.
Okay.
It also lists total project costs, which is just an amalgamation of the grant award and the leveraged funds amount that's up here. Barbara, you sounded like you had a question. Okay.
That all sounds good. I do have a question. If you can scroll down to the rental housing development, do we need to put outcomes here of like we anticipate working with 5 projects, or wait and deal with that on the address setup?
So I would put the anticipating working with 5 projects, not necessarily as an outcome, but in that when you set up the housing development in the budget, there was a narrative box.
Yeah.
I would put it
Mhm.
there. The actual outcomes like
Okay.
units and all of that stuff will be in the housing site address setup. So just
Okay.
the anticipated stuff can go in that little narrative box for that activity for now.
Okay.
Yeah, because I don't think we need to track that as an outcome in the same way. And there's other ways to track outcomes in the site address. This is just a feature that's automatically built into the system, but you don't need to worry about that. Okay. Did you have any other questions?
I do not.
Okay. In that case, we can move on. Similar to outcomes, that were attached to the activities. There's supporting documentation. I don't think we require any supporting documentation at the moment. If for whatever reason things would change, you'd have the opportunity to upload things on this page, but it's blanked out here because we didn't have anything. And that's the same as it was in Ocean. Now, very helpful. And I don't think Ocean did this. I never have done an application fully in Ocean, but there's this nice summary page where it lists out all of your information in one. So if you're pretty confident in what you've inputted, but you just want to do a general check through of everything at the end here, you'll be able to do that in the summary and not having to individually click through each section, which I think is helpful. It's also important to note that when our program staff are reviewing your application, this is what our screen will look like. It'll be very similar. We'll have it all listed out as opposed to us having to individually click through the sections. But they will have a general summary screen just like you will. But once you've confirmed all your information is correct, then you hit submit. It'll load for a second, but then it's going to pull you completely out of the application onto a different tab that will show you the progress of your application. So there's some good examples here. On this tab, this is one of the other applications that I opened but didn't actually hit submit. It's just going to say in progress here. And so if you know you have opened an application, or if you're not sure, you'll be able to go back through and find it here. Very important to you, though, is that there's nothing here that says the funding source or the app, or I guess in this case, it's referred to as the application type. It doesn't list that out here, which is not very helpful to you when you're trying to figure out which application you're looking at. We do have a ticket in to be able to build that function in, but it wasn't there by default, which is why I heavily recommended keeping your application numbers on you, because that'll be, at the immediate moment, that's the only way to distinguish between them. So just keep that in mind. But I will show you that there's this nice launch application button that'll just take you back in right in the beginning. And as you can see, this is a OHTF1 that I had open. I do want to show some of the information that it asked here. So this is, we won't go through each individual application because for all intents and purposes, they're pretty much identical with how they are set up. There are other questions here for project outcomes that are tied to OHTF. I don't know if that's significant at all, or if it was just pulled over from Ocean, but I wanted to make sure you saw that that was there and that you're not crazy, that it looks different from the homepage. But for example, like homeownership projects, I don't know if that would be relevant at all to this because this is all rental units. But for some reason,
the important thing on this screen is that you'll notice none of those fields are required. So you would only fill out any that were applicable to that funding source in this program.
Do you leave them blank or do you want zeros?
I would leave them blank because if you leave them blank, then they won't even try to pull into my grant agreement. Whereas if you put zeros, it's going to pull them into the grant agreement. I don't want that to confuse anybody.
Yep. Good to know.
Yeah. But I think there are some additional information here. So just know that you'd be filling out what's relevant to you. I don't think there's anything else different. No. Okay. So I'm going to go back out onto that general screen where you can track the application. So we started on home, we did start on home. We started at the home page, and then we went into the program applications to create it, to start the application. But this My Organization Applications page is where you go to look at an application that's already been started or submitted in this case. Also important, because everything's connected, this is the page where you do your draw requests. This is also the page where you do any reporting.
This is also where the site address is set up, I believe. It will have, it's called
Yes.
manage addresses in this system.
Yes. It's called manage addresses. And I think the draws are all tied to addresses. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the addresses are where the draws are tied to, which we can get into specifics at some point. But
Necessarily tied to the addresses. Like you could do a draw, for example, of admin without having any addresses set up and things like that. But obviously for any projects you're drawing on, we would need the address to be set up and approved.
But it is important. I don't know if Rachel's on here or not, if she's still on here.
Yep, she's here.
You know, this is the main page you'll be looking at since you're not necessarily the application preparer.
Cool.
So that's what's most important. You'll also see that you can track any application you've submitted. It'll show you when we've actually approved it. It'll also show you separately when it's actually ready for you to draw funds, when we've gone through the grant agreement process and all that. And then once it's completed, it should be marked as completed here. And then I think so you should have like a historical record as well of the applications you submitted, and that should be easy to look at.
And there will also be, I will say, full transparency, I don't know as much about what that looks like. Maybe Jake can step in for a second and help us with this, but this screen would also be where you would find the things for the environmental reviews, because again, they're not going to label themselves as draw ready until we have that request for release of funds. So Jake, is this where the ER stuff lives too?
Yeah, the button will appear sort of near where you'll do site address management or revision creation or launching the application. It should be right in that area there.
Awesome,
Yeah.
Thanks.
Will the ER be address specific? Because unlike CHIP, where the ER is at the grant level, for our projects, the ER is per address.
Yeah, as of right now, I believe it's built exactly the same as it was in Ocean, so it should transfer over well. We have the compliance folks in there until we all got booted out of the test system last week, and they're working on it to make sure everything runs the same, but it should be tied to the addresses, not the grant.
There could also be a similar set of statuses like shown here at the address level then, because
It'll be under
again,
the manage address screen. Like when you go into to manage each address, you'll be able to see what status it is in terms of whether something needs approved by us or things like that. Josiah, you're on mute.
Sorry, I took a drink of water and I did not realize I was still on mute. But Rachel, I don't think it gets that specific, like the applications on here. I think it may say like the status of where it is at, just generally. But I don't know how detailed the breakdown is, or if it's just like in progress, reviewed and approved.
Okay, well, that's currently roughly what the list is in an Ocean. So if it's similar to that, that'll work.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. I don't think we had the site address ready to look at, but I can take a quick look. Are there any like general questions while you have Ashley, Ian, Neely, and all of us here?
Yeah. So basically the application is just going to be the information we get from you all from the funding memo. We go in and basically this is just building the basics of the grant agreement that will be signed. And so then when we do addresses to update that, it's not going to have to trigger an amendment and all that jazz.
Yeah,
Right.
so the goal of this is to keep the grant agreement as general as legally possible so that we're not required to do as many amendments.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah, that will help speed things up significantly.
For sure. And we can talk about this when we get into site addresses, but the main reason we only have an individual activity under the general project budget is because with the way the site addresses are set up, they're connected to individual activities. And it's mostly it's mostly one for one. So you couldn't do one address connected to multiple eligible activities, even though, there's an almost non-zero chance that it would have multiple eligible activities, which is why we put it down under just one general project budget, and we'll just be confirming that what you're providing funds for are what would be eligible expenses under that grant. Because otherwise you'd have to duplicate the address 3, 4, 5 times per funding source, and that would have been awful.
Would not have sped things up. So when
No.
we go in under the address, will we be looking for like acquisition, rental construction, site
Yeah,
prep?
that's where you'll have your what is it, 5 or 6 little sub, and those would be where you'd associate the outcomes with that specific activity at the site address then. So if you pick your acquisition, it would be structures or parcels or square units of whatever. And then if you have units or interim rental assistance or whatever it might be, the outcomes specifically associated with that, but it'd be tied to the site address.
Is that what's set up in IDIS?
No, it's set up.
I thought it was just like that project address and any of the information about that project. I did not think that they got into number of structures and number of acres and all that.
No, they don't. They just, what makes it a bit confusing is IDIS's definition of activity is different than our definition of activity. That's what makes it a little complicated for us, but they don't get quite that granular.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay.
So I think in terms of timeline wise, just to give you all a picture of where we're at and where we're headed, the anticipated go live date